Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Paul VanderKlay. Many will know Paul from the work that he's doing in this little corner of the internet, scene, prominent voice in that community, but is also a pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. And yeah, this has been a conversation that I've wanted to have for a little bit. I think, gosh, going back to like October of last year, we've kind of been trying to nail down a time to have some conversation. Obviously, swimming in similar scenes, overlapping networks, that sort of a thing. And this is really, I think a really great time to be finally getting to talk based on a lot of stuff that's been happening in those networks around conversions to Christianity and this sort of broader conversation. So I'll set that up a little bit more in a second. But thank you so much, Paul, for joining me. I appreciate
It's
it.
great to be here.
Yeah. Setting context here. A lot of stuff is happening, and you're a great person to talk to about all this. I mean, we've been seeing lately this kind of trend of some rather prominent folks in this scene and in I guess you could even say kind of culture, making this sort of God pivot, as it's been called. And I recently had Jordan Hall on my podcast to talk to him about his conversion to Christianity, his recent conversion. But that's sort of emblematic or just sort of one instance in a number of other similar kind of changes in people's sort of faith commitments, and Andrew Huberman and Russell Brand now, and obviously going back to Jordan Peterson's kind of very public now engagement with Christianity, Christian thinkers, all this stuff. And then in response to my conversation with Jordan, it got me thinking a lot about what I felt was missing from the conversation. So I then did sort of a follow up talking about what I'd love to see as part of a metamodern Christianity conversation, and what so far I've kind of not seen as part of that, and tried to add that into the mix. And so my kind of hope and intention for this conversation is really to continue that, but to start something as well. I appreciate your perspective a lot. You're very well read, very learned person. Have a deep history with the Christian tradition. Of course, you're a pastor, so at both kind of the intellectual and the embodied, lived. Um, Angle, this is something that you can bring a lot of experience to and a lot of insight to. And being that we do overlap in these sort of shared networks, we're talking to a lot of the same people, John Vervaeke, and then of course those people talk to very similar sorts of people. So I wanted to, one, just sort of like have this as being sort of an opening to merge some worlds here and start to come into each other's conversation spaces and bridge conversations. But two, I could also see this very much being the beginning of a longer conversation, and one that I feel like needs to be had, and that different people are bringing different important parts to. And so for me, I frame that in terms of like a metamodern Christianity, but there are different ways of framing that. And so, yeah, that was sort of my thought about how we could tackle this, and that's the framing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how anything else you'd like to add to that framing,
No,
or
let's proceed. I'm really curious. I was looking at the video that you made, where you were sort of going back and forth and contrasting. I thought it was very interesting when you were contrasting the 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 historical critical and then the devotional, because that's something that when you many people, when they come into Christian ministry from especially a more conservative Christian tradition, I mean, that change basically created Bart Ehrman the skeptic. And the different tensions there. And whereas for the last couple of hundred years, Protestant and especially Protestant churches have sort of been trying to hold that tension together. I mean, basically what happened is that a lot of modernists just sort of I had a conversation yesterday with a guy who grew up in visiting. His parents didn't go to church, and he grew up in the South, and so all of his friends went to church. So he wound up going to church with all of his friends. And some went Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian, kind of the sample of churches in the South. And then when he decides he wants to get into ministry, he decides to go to a mainline seminary and he's going to this mainline seminary probably in the 90s. And one of the professors basically comes in and tells everyone, you all want peace and justice, but if you don't have Jesus, you don't have any peace and justice. Because his complaint was that these mainline seminary students were living lives of complete worldliness, getting all of this study about modernist interpretations of the Bible. And he said, but you don't live anything. You've deconstructed it all away, and your Christianity is an academic justification for your politics, but you live like the world. And they were sort of shocked that their professor would confront them on this. But obviously the professor was from a past generation that held those two things together. And I actually somebody just sent me a piece in the New York Times talking about how conservative Christian, a split amongst conservative Christians as to whether or not you should sort of endorse this hot women of the political right with guns and boobs. And because the past generation would look at that calendar and say that has no place in the Christian life. And the new conservatives are like, hey, let's just celebrate masculinity and femininity right there in the open. And so I think, the metamodern frame, which says, okay, we had modernity, we've had postmodernity, and you can't really live in postmodernity. So, but yet its critique has some validity. So how do you put this together? And right now it's sort of a mess.
Well, yeah, exactly. So let's jump into the mess, and try to, organize things a little bit and do some sense making around it. Because, I know that you talk about like what you see as being this sort of recession of modernity, or that there's something going on that's the modern is sort of well, it's actually interesting. Who's Matthew Arnold talked about in the poem Dover Beach, this sort of like incoming wave and then outgoing wave of faith. The wave of faith withdraws, but now there's sort of this sense that something about the modern world is also now withdrawing. And how we understand that, I think, is really important. But yeah. One of the things I'd like to do is get into what we think that could look like in a way that's sustainable, that works for people, that isn't kind of characterized by just a great amount of cognitive dissonance, or dissonance between, as you were just gesturing towards, like sort of lived behavior versus this sort of like intellectualized relationship to a faith, but somehow something that is a form of Christianity that's embodied and embedded in community, that's praxis driven, but then also has this intellectual depth and robustness to it that is anti-fragile, and that can somehow engage with the tradition and its images, its symbols, and its stories in a way that works, but works at a level that, and this is the question, right? So, in the conversation I had with Jordan Hall, it was very much the embeddedness and the community and the praxis. All that seems to be a way into this that people can find very intuitive. But I specifically wanted to explore with him the theological angle. Like, okay, given that, how do we understand these ideas? How do we understand these stories in light of, as you say, like postmodern critique and modern critique? And so, that's what I would like to explore, at least for this conversation. And the last thing for now that I want to say too is that I want it to be clear that while we maybe dance around these topics and explore them, and we might have different opinions, or we might challenge each other in certain things, but this is, I think, very much coming from a place of trying to do something productive, generative, and in good faith. And so I just want, both for you personally, but also very much people watching this, to understand that in that back and forth, in the what about this, oh, but wait, all that stuff, I hope that I don't, for example, come across during that as overly sort of antagonistic, let's say, or that I'm not, because I think this is something really important that we need to get right. So I just wanted to put that on the table and make sure that there's that shared understanding, and we can kind of continually, return to, uh, the kind of meta framing of how we're going about even having the conversation. But just wanted to throw that on the table. So, yeah. So I guess first question then, right? Very maybe kind of pointedly is like, what do you make of the modern historical critical lens applied to the Christian tradition and the lessons that we can legitimately take from that and should take from that going forward?
I think the modern. So at the beginning of the 20th century, you had this major fight in the church in the West, which was the modernist fundamentalist fight. And that entire fight was a product of the continued rise of modernity and application of modernity into not only the churches, but the lives of nearly everyone. And it came at them through government. It impacted families. It impacted communities, and it it impacted it. It was a slow. It was a slow rise, especially in church communities. Religious communities are designed in many ways to sort of buffer, um, because you have different gatekeepers for your community, and you're watching different aspects than others are watching. So you have this major fight in the 20th century, while the fight had been going on in academic circles for a while before then. But in the 20th century, it just starts hitting churches, and so then churches start dividing over this kind of thing. And when I first sort of became aware of this, I was a seminary student, and I was reading modern biblical commentaries.
Hmm.
And we'd go into source criticism, redaction criticism, all of these. Most people won't know what I'm talking about. For a generation, the most interesting thing about the Old Testament was that you had a documentary hypothesis, and everyone was trying to sort of interpret the Old Testament by sussing out the Yahwist, the priestly, and let's say the Deuteronomic tradition. The assumption was that the Old Testament was sort of patched together by incompetent editors, and we have just sort of this mess of a text. And then, of course, you had the synoptic problem in the New Testament, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke are quite clearly telling the same stories, and sometimes there's word for word correspondence between them, but then there's all these other additional materials. And so the the focus in modernity was to study that which a modern mind could have access to in confidence, which were the texts themselves. And then they tried to get into the communities behind the text and trying to use what was the new modern framing of history to understand all of this. And as a seminary student, I was reading this stuff and just thinking, this doesn't help me at all as a preacher.
Hmm.
If I get up there on Sunday morning and start talking about the documentary hypothesis or the synoptic problem, most people in the church are like, I'm just, I've got a marriage which isn't necessarily easy. I'm trying to hold down a job. Things are changing in my world rapidly, and you want to talk about the documents behind this book that I am sort of clinging to kind of keep some semblance of faith alive.
Hmm.
And of course, what happens then in neo-evangelical scholarship, and to a degree before that in the UK, was a realization that while they couldn't simply ignore modernity, it was really hard for people to live with it. And so there was always you would always sort of try to sneak in, okay, what is the meaning of the text and how can you apply this for your life? But that sort of lived in a different world from modernity. And then of course postmodernity comes in and sort of sweeps the whole thing away, and then all people are left with is politics. and grievance, and because that's the one thing that anyone can be certain of, which is a history of oppression, particularly among certain groups. And then where do you go? Now, then, for if you're lucky enough, as I usually was, to have congregations made up of mostly oppressed people, then you sort of could offer them a thesis of liberation, but then you bumped into eschatology and would have to say, now, when exactly does this liberation arrive, and by whose hand? And usually the idea was through a political hand. And I would say that's probably sort of where I was at when I left seminary.
Hmm.
And so then I decide, well, if I'm going to go announce liberation for oppressed people, I might as well go to some really oppressed people. So I go to some of the poorest people in the Western Hemisphere. And I very quickly realized that most of the people that I am now preaching to and ostensibly being there to help with, number one, completely don't buy any of this liberation stuff because they just don't believe it, because they know darn well that they are going to live and die poor, and maybe, just maybe, the best shot they have at some degree of the kind of liberation people are trying to offer them is to get a visa to the United States so they can make more money. And it's like, so in other words, this radical liberationist, slightly communistic gospel that I have, when I go down to actually oppressed people, what they'd really like to be are capitalists. And it's like, something here doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then the more I am actually, everybody's like, well, be with the oppressed, be with the downtrodden. The more I am with the oppressed and the downtrodden, you know what they want? You know what they're expecting? They're expecting heaven. They're expecting an upgrade in the next life, because they've looked around and they know they're going to die poor and young. And me, because of where I'm from and the access that I have, won't be caught in that misery. And so then I got to jump on this deconstruction fairly early on, and had to say, yeah, modernity, okay, postmodernity, even the people that, even your heroes aren't buying this stuff. So what now? And
yeah.
then
So
off I go.
yeah, so that there's a lot to work with there.
Yeah,
a lot going on there. So one of the things that I hear, which I think is really important, I think it's very spot on, is the disconnect between sort of church congregations and scholarship. We'll just kind of put a pin in that. So there's sort of like the relationship of average church-going people to the kind of modern, historical, critical stuff coming in. It's sort of like, wait, what? How is this? For all the reasons you just outlined. And then similarly, a disconnect with sort of the postmodern liberation theology approach to things. That's sort of like, no, as you say, like, just give me a green card, give me some resources to improve my lot, et cetera. And so granting all of that, right, that there's some real disconnects. What we can come back to, I want to come back to later on the postmodern liberation front, but just for the sake of sort of having a very clear dichotomy to work with there, I want to stick with that modern traditional devotional disconnect. And I think that this comes up a lot for people who go to seminary and then learn all this stuff and then ask that question that you did, like, how can where does this actually plug into, interacting with a congregation and all that. But I want to kind of probe that a little bit, right? Because I want to know what the response is at that level, let's say, right? Like let's say, you go to seminary, you learn all these things about the source criticism, you see that there are these like meaningful disjunctures and potential contradictions in the text and all of that. And then you get a new sense of what these texts are and what the history, as we can reconstruct it, might have been, et cetera. But then when you go into a congregation and people don't want to hear that stuff, what then do you do? Because it would seem in some ways almost disingenuous to like pretend like all that stuff doesn't exist,
Right.
right? It would seem like that would be problematic to just talk to people as though, oh, okay, we're just going to leave all that over here because this is what people need to hear or want to hear or what have you, right? And this has been a perennial issue for kind of informed seminary taught pastors and ministers. It's sort of like, how does this stuff come in a way that can connect to people's lives? So what are your thoughts on that? Like, how, do you see what I'm saying? Like, there would
I
seem
know
to be
exactly
like
what you're saying.
maybe like one connection, right, would be sort of something like we can all acknowledge that like we need a robust social fabric in our sense of like thinking about the country that we're a part of. If we think about our country as just, oh, it's nothing but awful and it's just a series of, oppressions and terrible people, and we have no respect or regard whatsoever for, just like the founding fathers and everything that happened, right? That leads to a kind of social fragmentation and sort of fraying of the civil fabric of society. At the same time, right, people teaching civics classes or like AP US history also have to grapple with and acknowledge, like, yeah, like Thomas Jefferson did own slaves and he did father children with them, or this and that, right? And like things that complicate and nuance and problematize some aspects of like that sort of national mythos. And so simultaneously, someone like that could recognize, oh, if we just push the kind of critical scholarship on all this stuff too forcefully, it's going to erode people's faith in their country and their sort of civic pride and their civic engagement, and that has deleterious impacts on society. At the same time, we can't ignore it either, right? So I'm just going to throw that in as a basis of comparison, as sort of like, what do we do when the history says something that then, doesn't work with sort of the average man on the street, and what do we do about that in a way that maintains integrity?
Well, you began by asking me about the and what happens in churches is that the pastors either become political activists or therapists.
Mm,
That's what they do. And that's what the churches do. And then very quickly, the church realizes it has no mission
mm,
because you already have political parties and you already have therapists. And so why would you give sacrificially for an institution that has already outsourced its mission to two other institutions, to either the political scientists or to the psychologists? And that is exactly what has been happening in churches, in the mainline church. That's sort of the destruction of the mainline church, that I'd
mm-hmm,
say it's collapse overall. Now, so that, then the question is, who is we when you ask that question? And so as a minister, that's exactly what I've seen happen to people who sort of get caught in that bind. Unless you can figure out, and I think this is where we come all the way back to where we started in terms of Jordan Peterson, Jordan Hall, this little corner, Jonathan Peugeot, John Vervaeke, these kind of questions, because these kind of questions are coming around to the question, okay, well, why, where is the role of, now you can sort of abstract it and talk about the sacred or the divine, that whole thing in sort of a functional approach. Or if you're in a church, well, why, when I was in Europe a couple of summers ago, I noted that in every little town you had a church in the middle of these little towns, and you had these spires and steeples to connect heaven and earth. And this is an alien technology to us. We don't know why those buildings are there or what to do with them. In fact, that's a real problem for some places. Is they really don't know what to do with these buildings because they're too beautiful to tear down, and they're iconic, but they don't know what they're seeing through them too. And so what I think we're seeing in this new renaissance of religion is a reappreciation for something that was lost, but we're still struggling to figure out how to talk about it.
mm-hmm. Right. Well, right. And so that is the question, right? Is sort of like, how do you talk about it? How, like, what is different about a minister or a pastor from a psychologist or a political activist? Once there's some grappling with that modern historical critical stuff, it seems to have the effect of sort of changing the game for a lot of people and sort of changing the register. And so, like, what remains in that area of conversation is one way of asking the question. Um, and I another thing that is a very, I think, important framing device for me, and I'd like to get your take on it, is is grappling with the ways that that there is, let's say, a kind of developmental angle to people's relationship with faith and religion. And when we look at how over the course of the lifespan, people's views change, their notions of faith change, this sort of a thing, then I wanted to throw that into the mix. And again, will be kind of probably a continual touchstone or a leitmotif because we'll keep coming back to it. I have a feeling. Because one way of framing all this, right, could be, yeah, people might, how would you say, there might be a certain attraction to, functionality for, and even necessity for certain, say, mythological framings in certain living conditions, in certain life conditions, especially in the kinds that you're talking about, where, you know, if you're if you're facing oppression, if you're facing a lack of resources, if you're facing those sorts of dynamics, that that will engender certain ways of thinking about the divine, the religious, etc. When modernity then does start to spread, and you start getting the kind of increase in the quality of life and the people and people's sense of sort of economic financial stability and this sort of a thing, there does seem to be this shift away from certain modes of sort of mythological anthropomorphic ways of thinking, and then into sort of more abstract, general, rational ways of thinking. And we could dive into all that, and we could even pick it apart, and we could critique that narrative. But it is a narrative, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. That everything you're saying might be the case, but it doesn't necessarily change or speak to the issue of, like, the reality of the material considered, right? Like, just because people might resonate with or feel the need for a certain kind of religion doesn't necessarily make that real either, right? So, you know, that's a frequent kind of line of way, you know, way of thinking about this. So anyway, your thoughts on any of that?
One of the early questions when I started, because I mean, I've been pastoring for a long time, and then I've been thinking about these issues for a very long time, and then Jordan Peterson comes on the scene, and I'm watching what's going on around him, and I'm trying to use, I'm blogging a little bit about him. I'm talking about him in a listserv that I participate in, and I'm not getting the kind of traction I really want. Most of my colleagues look at me and they're like, I'm going to spend 2, 3 hours a day listening to a Canadian psychologist ramble on about the Bible. I've got work to do. Fair enough. And so then I start talking on YouTube. And right away, one of the big questions is, what do we mean by this funny word real? Because Eugene Peterson, who was a Christian writer, he was a pastor in a mainline Presbyterian church, and they were doing church planting, and so he was a good writer. He wrote a number of books, very popular books, but he would always be galled when he would finish preaching a sermon, and this was back when it was still the alignment between church, when Christian nationalism was so ubiquitous we didn't have to point it out in other people. You know, some smart businessman would say, "Oh, that was a fine sermon, Pastor, but now we're going to get out here into the real world." And Eugene Peterson would be like, you know, part of him, something would turn inside. Part of what's happening is that when Jordan Peterson starts lecturing about the biblical lecture, people begin to see, oh, maybe the patterns in the Bible are still with us today. Hence, I can improve my map of the world if I read the mappings of the Bible. And of course, Jonathan Peugeot comes along and basically says the same things, but in more artistic, less psychological language. And John Vervaeke comes around and starts saying similar things, but now in the frame of cognitive science. I think the reason modernity isn't sort of, we don't deconstruct what we assume. I'll say it that way. And modernity begins to recede when we start seeing its edges. And all religions are sort of agendas to achieve the eschaton, our best life, to achieve the summum bonum, the greatest thing. And it's very reasonable that coming out of the medieval period, entering into the early modern period, we sort of together made an assumption that what it really takes to have your best life now is political stability, economic prosperity, good health, um, satisfying relationships. And the path to all of these things is basically getting a handle on usually affluence. So if you have a decent roof over your head, if you can get your material needs satisfied, if you can have enough material needs so that you can satisfy some of your other emotional needs, and it's a pretty strong argument. If all of these things are working together, well, you should be satisfied. But, fairly early on, people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky look at this and begin to say, doesn't really seem to work.
Mm-hmm.
But, many Haitians in the Dominican Republic who do not have a decent roof over their head, do not have enough to eat, do not have political stability, do not have many of the things that we in the West enjoy, they're like, well, I'd be willing to take a crack at it. People you sometimes find on Christian refrigerators, Lord, make me strong enough to be able to win the lottery. Okay. But what we begin to discover in the West is that this project of harnessing the physical universe in order to satisfy ourselves doesn't seem to work. Now, of course, Jesus made suggestions about that a very long time ago. You can gain the whole world, but lose your soul. And it's like, well, what if we decide we don't have a soul and we just stick with the world? Well, the funny thing was that the soul began to crop up. And I think that's sort of where we're at now, where people begin to, and you can see this in someone like Tom Holland, who he has a hit book called Rubicon. He's a successful author. He's living in London. He has everything he wants, but he begins to have doubts. And that's where we're at. Now, pointing to someone like Ian McGilchrist.
Well, but before I just want to throw out some thoughts. So yeah, just to I agree with all of that. I think that that's a very important framing, and also one that can really kind of help clarify something important. Because there was this sort of myth of progress, capital P, the grand narrative of modernity that was just focus on the material goods and this sort of thing, and then we'll actually solve all the things that religion used to say, that it was going to attend to, right? And this is sort of the story for some number of centuries, and Marxist materialism picks this up, and et cetera, et cetera. And empirically, we found that has some reality, but it actually then stops, right? It's sort of like you do need, as you say, a roof over your head. You need a certain level of sort of resources and safety and well-being and all that stuff. But then that starts to plateau, and then your well-being is no longer tied to those things just in a linear way. And the amount of kind of increase at the material level to engender any modicum of increase in general well-being is, the ratio becomes increasingly large. So I totally agree with that. And I mean, this is itself kind of accounted for in theories of modernity, like Ronald Inglehart's work talking about sort of post-materialist values, and you move into the postmodern and now beyond world where yeah, we've kind of acknowledged that, and there's this longing for a greater sense of depth and meaning and the sacred and the spiritual. And so that's different from, I would say the articulation for religious longing in a pre-modern context. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. And I think that that's what we're currently grappling with. And one of the things that I'm seeing, though, is that in that moment where people are having that sensation and reaching for that, it seems like the only thing available to them is pre-modern forms of religion. So then they sort of like kind of jump into some version of that. And for me, the challenge is like, well, that's going to create a lot of problems, a lot of cognitive dissonance, a lot of this and that. So how do we articulate? How do we live some kind of spiritual, sacred existence in a post-materialist context? And so I wanted to clarify that too, because I'm not by framing religious conceptions developmentally, it's not to make the case that all forms of religion are just sort of like pre-modern people want stuff, and so they, project this heaven or whatever. But I do think it's relevant to appreciate that some form of religious expressions are some version of that, but that what we're currently grappling with is sort of this different context. So I wanted just to say all that, but I also now, I mean. And I don't want to cut you off if you wanted to go somewhere else with this.
No,
but
go ahead.
You brought up the real. And this is, I think, really the stumbling block for me in my thinking about this stuff, because it's like something is really important here that we have to grapple with. But yeah, like what do we mean by the real? I also buy what you were saying, that like Peterson and others can draw out the patterns and the psychological mappings and all this stuff in a way that's of great utility and worth to people, and in a way that they can affirm in a modern context. But that's different from saying that those stories are real in the way that certain people want to interpret that, right? Like Bruno Bettelheim wrote a lot about fairy tales and their utility, but no one would say that, Little Red Riding Hood is a real story about historical things, right? So we need to be clear about what we mean by real. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion's coming in, and what I want to kind of tease apart, because I think that's a lot's getting smuggled in when we talk about what's real in the religious traditions here. And there's a lot of confusion around saying, hey, there are some deep archetypal patterns here and insights about the nature of reality and truth and our experience of relationships, etc., versus a person was born, in ways that completely contradict the laws of nature as we understand them, and there were these miraculous things that happened, and there's not a lot of clarity around what we mean by the reality of those things. So, can you speak to some of that? I mean, I have a sense that we might have a different conception between the two of us of the reality of these kinds of stories. Like, can you speak to how you think of these stories as being real, specifically in relationship to like the historical aspect of things?
Okay, but now we're going to talk about this word real, and you just basically used historical like a modernist, I assume, because what the historical question, what the historical quest is trying to get some kind of correspondence between a physical state of affairs and a group of words, because that tended to be the modernist framing and conception. For example, how is Uncle Sam real? That's a question.
Uncle Sam is real as a symbolic creation that we refer to, but there is not actually a person who exists named Uncle Sam, and there never has been.
Does Uncle Sam have a body?
No, and not in the way that we would think of that sort of a thing. And well, go on. This, yeah.
Well, Uncle Sam doesn't have a body like I have, but I would say Uncle Sam does have a body. But you have to then ask the question, what is a body?
Yeah,
because and now, I have a church body. My church body meets here in this place on Sunday, but not all of it is here. We have a body politic. And so, and this is exactly the key reframing that has been happening in this little corner.
But there's a lot of there's a lot of equivocation going on there, right? Because like a word like body can mean a bunch of different things, right?
Oh,
Like,
yes, it can.
yeah, exactly. So then, and
As
just
can history, as
oh
can
yeah, yeah.
real.
So then it warrants having conversations like this where we can get some clarity about what we mean rather than sort of
Absolutely.
talking past each other.
Absolutely.
Real quick, I do want to make a plug for the work of Jason Storm, who explores just these topics in his book Metamodernism, talking about he has a frame of meta realism, and that what we mean by real is in what we mean by real is a contrast term, right? There is no absolutist sense of what we mean by real. If you say that that's not the real Madonna, are you talking about it's not the real, singer Madonna? You're not, all this stuff, right? So
Right.
we have to be careful with how we use this word, and we can appreciate that real is a kind of a modal term that has, so I just want to throw that in, and I don't want to get too technical or philosophical, but let's drill down on this, right? So when you asked about Uncle Sam, does he have a body? Well, body now is relating to this idea of Uncle Sam as a person, right? But then now we're switching and we're using this term body metaphorically to talk about the body politic. And it's like that was sort of a little turn that happened. But if we can just say, well, that's also real, then we're kind of just going to keep not really getting to the crux of it, right?
No,
So,
but we're getting to your definition of what you
yeah,
mean by real.
yeah.
Because most mean physical when they say the word real. And I would argue that Uncle Sam, in fact, has a physical body, but it's not the kind of body that you are currently seeing little bits of
Mm-hmm.
in over Zoom right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been using that word body. For example,
Mm-hmm.
is school spirit real?
Yes.
Yeah. And a school has a body.
A school has a bunch of students that we refer to collectively as a body. Yeah.
And we've been using that word for that collection of students for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
as we've been using the word spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I were to say that because of what the Japanese Empire did, Uncle Sam strode across the Pacific and beat the Imperial Japanese Navy to a pulp, that would be a very real statement.
It would be a metaphorical statement. It would be using a representation of historical actuality and then like eliding it in a kind of poetic way. But this is the point, right? So then we need to be able to disentangle these different forms of the real. And so this is what I want to drill down on, right? It's sort of like if we want to talk about Christ resurrected from the dead, a lot of people mean that as there was a human being whose physical body came back to life and then he went and walked around again, right? Now, another way you could say Christ, resurrected from the dead is, well, his spirit lives on and it changes the world, et cetera, right? And that would be real in all the ways that you're talking about, but it means something very different. And it's important that we get that meaning right. So if you don't mind me asking, kind of directly, do you think that Christ physically, historically, as a person, came back to life, and that is what the resurrection is speaking to?
I think that Thomas touched his wounds.
So yes, so that the physical body of
because you see, here's the problem. We can say all of language is metaphorical. It just is. I mean, I just said it. We can't speak in any other way. And we always speak this way. And there's actually no way of getting around it and no way of living in the world. Because even if you're using,
yeah.
even if I say 1 + 1 is 2, well, how is this 2? This isn't 2. It's and that gets to the very basis of our technology and of because we're always representing the world with symbols.
But to shift the conversation out of such a charged context or content as religion, if we were to apply this in other areas of life, it would create a lot of problems, right? Like if your child, if you ask them, hey, did you take the car on Saturday? And they say no. And then it turns out that actually they drove the car on Saturday and then they came back and they crashed it or whatever. Then you'd confront them. You're like, wait, I asked you, did you take the car on Saturday? And you said no. And they said, well, I didn't take the car. taking implies, this, right? So like we can play all sorts of games with language, but
Oh,
what you were trying to,
I'm not asking to play games. I'm
yeah,
just trying to point to how we already use language and the ways that we have been using language.
yeah,
For example, literal does not mean physical. And almost every time someone says literal, they really mean physical
mm,
because they're asking, let's say, about the body of Jesus of Nazareth
mm-hmm,
that all of his disciples saw. And embedded in these are a whole bunch of assumptions, such as I actually just picked up Carlos Erie's recent book, They Flew, where you have all of these crazy stories, which actually really pick up in the early modern period of like levitation.
mm-hmm,
And we all know people don't fly,
mm-hmm,
even though, yeah, there certainly is equivocation when I say I flew to Detroit. Well,
right,
I used an airplane.
right,
But so so a lot of what's been happening is like for me, I have never really had a problem with all sorts of things that I read in the Bible, such as healing miracles. And I think recently we had an amazing demonstration. Tammy Peterson. Not only did Tammy Peterson have a form of cancer that for the last, I don't know how many decades, zero people who have had her kind of cancer have been alive 1 year after diagnosis. Zero
mm-hmm,
of everyone who's had that kind of cancer. And then she she had two doctors, and they went around to the best doctors that they could buy, and they have a lot of money. And then she tells her husband, God is going to heal me on our anniversary. And then she's cancer free, and she's cancer free now. And we look at this and we say, what does this mean?
mm-hmm.
How do we use language around something like this? And we just don't know. But
Well,
the world is full of this.
I mean, there's a lot to that. I mean,
Yeah.
so so we
So
could,
yeah, so in terms of Jesus, yeah, Jesus Jesus walked out of that grave. But what's interesting is that we don't have any the Gospels don't write that. And when you get to the resurrection, it actually gets very weird
mm-hmm,
because do they recognize him? Do they not recognize him? What about the wounds? I mean,
yeah,
it gets very weird. And in many ways, our language isn't helpful because we say Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and Jesus raised Jairus's daughter from the dead. Jesus raised the son of the widow of Nain from the dead. Jesus' resurrection is like that, but it's also not like that. And Christians have always said that too.
mm-hmm,
And then Jesus flies up into the clouds.
right,
And actually, this Christians have been talking about these kinds of issues for a very long time. And I think one of the best modern treatments of this is C.S. Lewis's book on miracles.
mm,
Because when we ask a question, so Lewis then in a chapter in that book focuses on the ascension. And when we say in the Apostles' Creed, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. Now, on one level, a whole bunch of people might, in their imagination, picture kind of a cloudy blue space and
mm-hmm,
a really well-decorated chair and another little smaller chair right next to them. And then, well, they might think of something, let's say, that they saw in the Sistine Chapel on
yep,
the big chair. And then
yep,
they might see something that, let's say, they saw in some Christian campy art on the chair next to it. And so then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, what do we mean by that?
right,
Is and this gets really complex with Jesus because again, Thomas touched his body, but he came into a locked room. So all of these questions are surrounding us. And what happens in the modernist fundamentalist fight is that fundamentalists start saying, yeah, he physically rose from the dead.
mm-hmm,
Or they'll usually say he literally rose from the dead, which is even more correct because we're talking about what the words on the page say
mm-hmm,
instead of physical correspondence. And that's the way modernity sort of sneaks in. But what else are we saying? And how are we using language? And in fact, that is
yeah,
when it comes to metamodernity, I think where a lot of our focus is, which is modernity. In modernity, we began using language in a different way, and we began making distinctions like we didn't make before. And part of the difficulty is that once we start making certain distinctions, we can't unmake them, but then we don't quite know what to do with language. For example, Owen Barfield, one of C.S. Lewis's good friends,
Mm-hmm.
he was a philologist. He goes back in time and says, you know what? People usually didn't used to distinguish between, let's say, spirit and wind.
Mm-hmm.
And today we would say physical wind is air blowing against my skin that I can feel. And we just started talking about school spirit. And we don't say, let's have a pep rally to really increase school wind.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say it that way, actually you begin to recognize that there's a whole lot of wind involved in that pep rally, isn't there?
Well, so
okay.
Yeah.
And these are the questions that we are now wrestling with.
Sure. And I mean, if I could just take a couple stabs at some of this stuff, I want to come back to the miracle thing specifically, as it related to the cancer diagnosis and all that, because I actually think, it provides a good opportunity to explore some of the real ethical issues that get caught up if we see
how
things.
Did you use real there?
What did I say?
You said real ethical issues. Are ethical issues real, and in what way?
Well, there I was using real more emphatically, like really, like this is really important.
No, but I think you're also using it in the other way. Because they're real ethical issues. Well, they really matter.
Sure, and if you want, we can have a whole conversation around the reality of ethics. I mean, I'm happy to do that too. I have thoughts about that. But obviously that'd be a bit
I see. I'm having fun right now. I hope you're having fun.
I'm having fun too.
What I enjoy doing.
Yeah,
okay,
good. Yeah.
So because you gave that little disclaimer early, and I mean, I don't mind. This is the kind of conversation I enjoy having.
Good,
so
good,
keep
good.
going.
No, good. No, the disclaimer up front was because these are sensitive topics for people. I mean, like many family members of mine would watch this conversation and probably be very mad about my line of questioning. So this is very intimate.
And let's not also lose the fact that you use the word sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't use it really in a physical context, because we would generally use sensitive in terms of, but sensitive in a body, because I would say that you use the word perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Because in terms of the body that is your family, what we're doing right now is quite sensitive.
Yeah.
In terms of a world that is by no means, it's connected to the physical world, but it's governing the physical world.
Sure. Well, so yeah, to reply to some of this, I hear multiple things being said at the same time in a way that some of them I can affirm, and then it's sort of like, but then the next sentence is like, oh wait, but that's back to this other way of thinking about it. And for me, there's a lot of what lands as a conflation going on, and that's what I want to tease apart, right? Because if we are going to do the sort of exegesis of the text as focusing on symbol and an extension of meanings, right? Like for example, you mentioned Jesus ascending into the sky. So there's, on the words of the page, Jesus ascends into the sky, and
so that's literally true.
And
the words on the page.
Those are the words on the page.
Literal.
So the words on the page are that, but these are Jesus as a person in the story, and ascend, suggests a
he
movement
flies
up. Yeah. And then the sky is a referent that we know of. And so this all together read creates a picture in our minds that has been depicted in, a lot of art of Jesus floating up into the sky. Right. Okay. So that's sort of, that's one reading. Now, in the past, in pre-modern contexts, yes, people had very different senses of causality. There weren't the modern notions of how certain phenomena behave in certain regular naturalistic ways. And so a statement like that in a text would land as, yep, he went up in the sky. Like that's what happened. But now after all that, then we have to fold that in, right? So then we're like, okay, so human beings don't like ascend into the sky that we've ever seen. No, you're looking at me like that's not true.
There's all sorts of, I mean, again, just look up Carlos Erie. Book just came out. They Flew. That's the title of the book.
Okay, yeah.
And he gets into this question because
Okay,
it's a very remarkable question. And
okay,
you'll find, you can go to Tibet and you can ask people in Buddhist monasteries, do people levitate? So, oh yeah. You go to the
right,
Catholics, ask the Catholics, do people levitate? They'll say, oh yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
But those are
they
both
drew
pre-modern.
pictures of
Those
it.
are,
They do.
but those are,
And so then the question would be,
yeah.
why don't you think this happens?
Right. So then the answer in my mind to that is that there's a lot that changes in our understanding of the workings of reality between the pre-modern and the modern periods. And you get people like Newton coming along, you get the Galileos, you start tracking the mechanisms at play, right? And we start being able to put laws to these sorts of phenomena, that there's a law of gravity and it behaves in such and such a way, and you can predictably drop things in the land here, blah, 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 blah. These get developed and complexified into the whole robust apparatus of scientific thought. And then this begins to change people's perspective on the world. And also then, and I think that there is a lot of truth to this as well, that needs to be accounted for in a sensitive way, that sociologically, the worldview that you inhabit you could say permits or inhibits certain kinds of interpretations or even experiential phenomena, right? Now, I want to be clear from the modern perspective. I think you could even totally affirm that, but the understanding would be that people, if they're, oh, I mean, the classic, example would be if you grow up Christian, let's say in a medieval Catholic context. Strong chances are, if you have a religious vision, you're going to see Jesus or Mary or one of the saints, right? You're not going to see Buddha. You're going to see Krishna, right? So, like, at the same time, you hop over to the subcontinent, and if you have a vision, you're going to see those entities. And so clearly, your cultural worldview and the sorts of symbols and all that available to you is going to inform the kinds of experiences that you have and how you interpret them. And this is all very complex. And I don't mean to overcomplexify it, but like there is a profound way in which every single person gets socialized into a particular worldview, and then that factors into how they see things. So I think that what I would say though is that this isn't relativistic. It's not sort of like, yeah, well, if you're, if you're just socialized in here versus here, it's all the same. And that's the postmodern move. The metamodern move is to say, no, this is all true. And if you enter into a different worldview, you're going to have different kinds of experiences and different kinds of interpretations. But we can relate those worldviews to each other and actually track the ways in which one leads to the other, and that one develops out of the other, and one reveals more about the complexity of reality more than others. And so that, I think, is one of the key metamodern approaches, is trying to show that, like, actually modernity really got some things really right about the mechanical nature of certain things and naturalistic forces, etc., over and above the pre-modern worldview. And that, like, if we don't do that justice, then, like, we're going to be in trouble, and, like, we won't have airplanes, but
I
we'll
agree
have,
100%.
yeah. So I would say that when now we read a text like Jesus ascended into the heavens, right? Now, given all the hundreds of years that have passed and the new information that we have about what we even mean by the heavens, which is that, like, not Olympus and not, clouds with a firmament and this sort of a thing, but actually like this vast ocean and expanse of space with planets, all this stuff, right? And what we mean by ascend, levitate, etc. From the modern lens, those things are no longer viable sort of interpretations of that text. Now, but two things there, right?
No, what? See, I don't think that's true.
Okay. Yeah. So
there are many people that say this can't happen because people don't levitate, but that's a tiny group of people. And here, I'll give you another example. So, well, I can give you a great example that I use on the channel. Daniel L. Everett was a conservative Christian. He wanted to translate the Bible for a group of people. He went to that people. He lost his faith in the end, but he opens the book with a really funny story where he and his daughter, they're living in this village, and suddenly there's a whole commotion in the village. And everyone in the village is like, there's the God. There's a God across the river. They're polytheists, they're animists. There's a God across the river, and the whole village is sitting there pointing out the God. And he and his daughter, so his daughter's grown up among these people, they get up and they look across the river and they don't see the God. Well, is the God there? I don't think modernity, and actually, if you look at someone like C.S. Lewis would say, well, who's lying? Well, I don't think Daniel Everett and his daughter are lying. They're not liars. I don't think the village is lying.
I agree.
So then you have the question, why can't they all see the same thing?
Right.
And then if you go down to, then we get into like cognitive science, we begin to recognize that when I walk into this room, and I actually learned this years before because I knew someone with very low vision, and I actually would have conversations with him about what he would see and what he didn't see, and what I would see and what I don't see. And we begin to recognize that this whole business of seeing is a lot more complex than it is. Now, to the degree that modernity says someone there is a liar, then I think modernity is wrong, because I don't think anybody was lying.
Yeah, I agree. I think, no offense to C.S. Lewis, but I always found the liar, lunatic, lord thing to like kind of miss the whole point. Like,
well, you should definitely read his treatment of the ascension in his book Miracles.
Okay.
Because it gets into all of these issues, and basically, and this again is why we're sort of getting beyond modernity, because even our theories of sight, I mean, we see with our brain, that involves our eyes. So if your eyes are going bad, your brain will have difficulty seeing some things. But this business of seeing is a lot more complex than we thought it was.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with all that, right? So like, even just to use a very immediate example, like still at my parents' house, if I go down in the basement and it's super dark, I'm like, it gives me the willies a little bit, right? And even though rationally I know that like, well, there's no goblins or anything down here, whatever, but like just that like entering a dark space, especially if you've just like watched a creepy movie or something, like you're just jittery and on edge, and you have this embodied sense of like, ugh, right? Now, if you inhabit a world in which that feeling is actually directly related to, entities, to demons or to spirits or jinn or what have you, then that feeling can actually translate into there's a spirit down there, and I don't want to.
There's a spirit. There's a lot of spirits down there.
And so, then what's interesting is that we get this layered effect from sort of cultural intellectual evolution, where we can have an embodied sort of primate experience, or a certain kind of like very I don't know, low level kind of brainstem experience, where something is triggered in us at a very primal level, but then overlaid on that, we got our neocortex being like able to think about that from sort of a meta level and assess it and all that stuff. And then you get that kind of dissonance of like, oh, I feel all creeped out right now, but I know that nothing's wrong rationally. You see what I mean? But also those proclivities, those faculties are emphasized in different cultural contexts in different ways. And especially before there's even kinds of studies done about certain phenomena, then there's no reason not to believe in certain kinds of things. And so when you live in a social context and you have that embodied experience and it affirms certain things about experience and reality, then yeah, you will see a God on the other side of the river. And if you don't inhabit that world, you're not going to see it. But I think the modernist lens would say no one's lying, but people might be pointing to a phenomenon that they're not accurately understanding or representing to themselves.
Which group would be that?
I would say in that context, if someone sees a God across the river, that would be a kind of illusion in the same way. This, from the modern lens, would be in the same way that any kind of like if we see a mirage, right? There's all these stories of, oh, there is this in the desert, or seeing great sea monsters and things like that. And then over time, it's sort of like, oh, this person was actually probably seeing, like a whale penis, or we also know the kind of shimmerings effect that plays of light can, cause, right? And so then after that rational explanation gets overlaid, it's sort of like, oh, okay, well, that's what that was. But that's then, If we're
Well,
trying to
let's
think about
talk
it
about you going
ontologically.
back home,
Yeah.
because I think that's a great example. So you go back home, and if you're like me, for example, when I was a missionary overseas, my parents were still living in the house that I grew up in. I came back home. I had my wife and my child, and I lived in my home. It was really funny because when I was in the home, I always sort of felt sort of like I was a kid again in some ways, even though at that point I was a husband and a father and all of those. There was, in a sense, a spirit in that home. Then when my parents moved to a different home, I didn't quite feel the same way. The spirit wasn't in the new home in the way it was in the old home. Just like if, let's say, you go back to can you go back to the school that you went to high school in? Now, you might enter the building and you might feel the spirit in the building. So there very much is a spirit in the building. And so what in a lot of ways we're getting at is the reality of the spirit world. That's
But
what we're
it's
talking
but
about.
it's not a spirit in the building. It's an experience someone is having based on their memories and their whole nervous system embodied, experience from that then gets
Let's say
triggered
they
by.
tore down the building you went to and built a new building and you went in, you wouldn't feel the same way
No,
because the
it's
spirit was in the building.
well, the spirit isn't in the building because the spirit isn't a thing. It's an experience that is triggered
The
transjectively
spirit
by.
isn't a thing.
No, I don't think
School
so.
spirit is very much a thing. Talk to the principal, talk to the teachers, talk to the students. School spirit is very real and it's very much a thing. The question is, what kind of a thing is it?
Well, but all right.
That's the question.
So are you familiar with the idea of like reification, like or misplaced concreteness and this sort of stuff, right? Like that a lot of what we call things are processes for one, and that's kind of Whitehead's point that like Western philosophy has a kind of misplaced concreteness because it looks at a lot of processes and calls them things, and we have a substance ontology that needs to be corrected for by a process ontology.
We do have an ontology that needs to be corrected for it. Well, Vervaeke introduces every now and then he introduces the concept of the hyper thing. So
Mm.
the economy is a hyper thing. I don't like the term because it has the word thing in it, and because I think the ecology or the economy is more like a spirit than a thing. Because when I think about a thing, I think about like this lens cap. But I
Hmm.
can use the word thing for the economy, and I can use the word thing for school spirit. But I think that actually the economy is more like a spirit than like a thing.
Well, let's take all this conversation, but then switch context and see if that reveals anything.
Okay.
So, which is basically to say, let's shift into a different religious tradition.
Okay.
My understanding is that there's a story, for example, I'm not sure if it's in the Quran or the Hadith, but it's in part of the Islamic tradition that Abraham on a horse was on the Temple Mount and then basically ascended into heaven from the Temple Mount on a horse. That's a claim that's actually structurally very similar to like Jesus ascending into heaven. Did that, however you want to go about
Watch your
answering that, did
language.
that happen? Was that real?
Did
You
it?
know?
Did Abraham physically mount a horse and ride up into heaven?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm a little skeptical.
Okay. But if I ask you, did Jesus ascend into heaven physically? What's your answer?
I think so
Okay. So can you explain why you're skeptical of one and not the other?
because I'm a Christian.
Okay. Is that like, but now if someone were like, hey, someone stole the candy from the store, I think it was your sister. And then if another person's like, well, I think it was your sister, it's like, well, why do you think that? It's like, well, because my sister is my sister, so I have to protect her. And the other person's like, well, right? Like, that's not a good reason to think that something didn't happen. So just because you're part of a tradition or a family or something doesn't mean that like your sister didn't steal the candy
Yeah.
or that your story might not have happened. So why does saying because I'm a Christian give you more credence into that story versus
Well,
others?
it's you asked me why I believe it. It's because I grew up believing it, so it's pretty easy for me to believe one rather than the other. I mean, and it's just, I mean, and everybody will accept that. That doesn't mean that necessarily if you have to answer the question, did Abraham physically mount a horse and fly up into heaven? Paul VanderKlay is the best person to ask. you're in trouble in terms of how you exactly want to figure out whether or not this happened.
I mean,
But
we could use it as just an example of
and then when
many,
we get
many.
into my sister, that's a very different situation because I know her quite well. Maybe let's say there's a lot of, I mean, part of the difficulty with history is that we really don't have access to a lot in terms of the physical layer. In fact, very little in history do we have access to, let's say, physical layers. And of course, crimes get into this because, you know, they don't let anybody in the scene. So then we're sort of in the realm of human testimony. And then we have to figure out what to do with human testimony. And we begin to, and anybody who deals with human testimony on a regular basis, just even a car accident or something like that, figures out that on one hand, witnesses are sometimes unreliable, but often they're the only thing we have. And so then we're stuck in that realm.
Yeah. Well,
And even when you get to, so as a preacher, we can go back to the resurrection of Jesus, because I don't think that's necessarily more sensitive than the ascension when we're talking about the kinds of things we're talking about here. The difficult, so people would come to me and they'd say, okay, Pastor, I'll even give you that Jesus walked out of the tomb and Thomas touched his hands. I'll give you that. And then he flew up into the sky. Now, so what? There's a good question. Now we're asking a good question, because history is full of strange things. And when you look at, let's say, there books are, Tammy Peterson's Miracle, levitations of Buddhist and Christian saints, stuff that happens in Pentecostal churches all the time. The world is full of this stuff. I remember when my father died, my parents had two cars. My father died rather suddenly. And the car that my father drove was a little older than the car that my mother drove of their two cars. And it never happened before that something was happening with the locks in the car. And my mother got frustrated. And so she said, Stan, cut that out. And then it never happened again. Now, what was that? I don't know. There's realms of questions I don't know. But my mother isn't a liar. I'm sure the things were happening with the locks. So how do we frame this and understand that? Well, I think now we're very much into a metamodern conversation, because we're not just sticking in the modern frame. And we're not just sort of, the postmodern was pretty effective in some ways at sort of exposing elements of modernity that modernity just sort of slid over for whatever reason. But then we also realized that it is kind of impossible to live in a postmodern frame, because that doesn't really work either. So now we're sort of in the frame of saying, okay, well, we've got all of this stuff. What do we do with it? Yeah. And I can find two people, one of whom says, I believe Jesus physically rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, and I can very, in a modernistic way, sort of embrace the Apostles' Creed. Great. And they live a totally dissolute life. And another person says, I'm a little foggy on this resurrection and the ascension, but I'm really trying to live as Jesus said to live. Then you might ask the question, okay, for which person is Jesus more real? And is his resurrection more real? Oh, that's kind of an interesting question.
So on the metamodern front, I want to make the case that I don't think that there's a danger of thinking that we've moved beyond modernism or postmodernism just by the fact of like not fully integrating their insights. So
Right.
part of the interesting aspect of this conversation for me is to see how much of the modern paradigm, we can affirm. And I don't think we have to affirm all of it. I think there's a lot that's deeply problematic about it. And I've written about that various places, and the reductionism and the overemphasis of material rather than the natural, all this stuff. But I think that if we just use metamodernism as sort of a way to reclaim traditional ways of thinking, then it's sort of like missing something really, really important. So that's part of why I think this conversation is important. But to your then you raise this whole other thing about basically the pragmatic utility of a certain kind of way of being and believing certain things. And again, like that could all be what would you say? That could all be of value, right? But if you're asking questions about, what's real, what, the ontological basis for any of this, that like I could, many people do believe many things that aren't real, but they might serve some kind of utility for them. Now, I do think it's
What
worthwhile.
did you mean by real right there?
I mean, in this context, that we're talking about stuff that happens in the world, and that our language does it
Does
can.
school spirit happen?
So let me address this because well, we should.
This is
Yeah.
important.
Okay. So I am interpreting this line of thought as being very ambivalent, or no, that's not the right word. Conflationary and what's the word I'm looking for? We're we're speaking. Oh, John Vervaeke uses the term all the time. Amba. Anyway, there's two meanings simultaneously that we're eliding, or we're not being clear. And I think that we should be clear. Like, there's no reason why we should uh, base this in a kind of like semantic confusion.
Agreed.
So I think that there are different kinds of speech acts, right? If I say to my wife, or like or recite a Shakespeare sonnet, my love is like a red, red rose, or you are like or not even like, if I use straight up metaphor, right? Like, you are the sun. Well, she's not really the sun, right? But she's some kind of, what's going on there? Like,
But
yes.
why would you use that phrase? I mean,
So
if you're really thinking poetically and you say to your wife, you are the sun.
yeah, because the experiences of the sun engender certain associations and connotations of light and prettiness and warmth, and that there are analogs to my relationship with her, but it's an analog. It's not, she is not the sun. Now, my problem is that a lot of folks engaging with traditional religion actually think that she's the sun or the equivalent of it, right? That like these.
No, I don't think anybody would be confused by that if hearing that you said this
No, no,
about
no.
your
I'm
wife.
not saying that anyone. I'm saying I'm using that as a comparison to the sorts of truths people espouse about the way things are in a traditional devotional way that aren't that way, right? Did Jesus ascend into the heavens? Did Abraham ascend into the heavens on a horse? Did the Buddha jump out of his mother's womb the day he was born and say, "Today I shall," or in this life I shall achieve enlightenment? And I think from a modern historical critical angle, we should take very seriously that the answer to all those is no.
Why?
So, with the capacities of modern scientific thought, we can begin to identify enduring natural laws that function in reality and understand the naturalness and the regularity of nature in those terms. And I think that if we don't take that seriously, we're just throwing out the entirety of like the core insight of the modernist lens.
No, no,
So,
no. I don't want to throw that out.
yeah.
I'm a pretty skeptical person. Okay. But why would they have written things like Abraham flying up into heaven? And why would the disciples have remembered and recorded in the haphazard way that they did in the Gospels their recollections of their interactions with Jesus
Well,
after
yeah,
the
like that's a
crucifixion?
good example, right? Like the historical critical method reveals that those weren't the disciples writing those things. So that's not eyewitness testimony to an experience. And so now we're back in the realm of history and why it matters for faith. Because like,
No, no, I'm not saying that the disciples wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John.
okay,
I'm saying that the people that wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing it down because they believe this is the testimony of the disciples. And in some
do they?
cases,
Do they?
Mark,
I mean, now
I
you're
think
making a
so.
historical claim, right? And
Yeah,
then
I think they did.
okay. Okay, so
But I
then
might be wrong, but I
but
think they did.
but it's important, right? It really, like, if the gospels
It
were
is
written,
important.
if they were written 10 years ago by a guy named Jerry, we might not take them that seriously, right?
Right.
If they were right. So history really is important. And so if we use the methodologies of modern historiography to try to elucidate these texts and understand them better in these traditions, and it gives us certain answers that would say, oh, actually, no, like for example, right? Like if you want to talk about the birth narratives of Christ, you've got Matthew and Luke, and they tell very different stories, right? So what tradition are they recounting? Where did that come from? This sort of a thing, right? Now, sociologically, we can make great sense of these sorts of things in a modern historical critical framing. We can say, yes, look, all over the world in the pre-modern era, people told stories about things, and they wanted to imbue their stories with a sense of profundity and majesty and sublimity, or show how special something was, etc. And they also did a lot of that in the context of a different worldview, a different
But when you
cosmology.
say that, are you saying they did that consciously?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
Those, in some cases, like in the pseudepigraphal writings, we know that people knew that they weren't Abraham or they weren't Adam and Eve, yet they were writing under those names.
Yeah.
And so there are a number, like the pastoral epistles in the New Testament are written like they're Paul writing, but we know that Paul didn't write them. So someone was actually lying in that case, you could say.
Well, we also know that Paul didn't physically write the book of Romans.
Okay.
But everybody thinks he wrote it.
So, but again, like, equivocation, that was the word I was looking for.
That's the word you're looking for.
So, like, again, let me throw.
But that gets into this question of authorship, which itself is really tricky, because physical authorship is one thing, but then what exactly is, and you can look at, let's say, the Johannine corpus. We can use some of that fun language. Who wrote all of these Johannine books? Do they arise out of the community? But this again gets to be to the moment that we started out with, in terms of in Jordan Peterson. You're not gonna find Jordan Peterson really camping out on Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, or Pauline authorship of the book of Timothy, or John the disciples authorship of the book of Revelation. He's not going to camp out on any of those things. But the kinds of arguments he makes are that not all texts are the same. And in fact, he makes an argument that basically says it's functionally a Darwinian argument, that it could be that the truth of a text is seen by the product of the texts. In other words, you're sort of using a different definition of the word real.
Yep, I get that. For
example, who is more real to me, Uncle Sam or Donald Trump?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I get the line of argumentation. I find that it's one line of argumentation, and it is being proposed simultaneous to the other one, which is actually affirming the historical accuracy of these accounts. And so I find that there's something to use a word like disingenuous is not what I want to do, because I don't think that there's any bad faith involved. I just find it intellectually, it doesn't seem.
The question is, what do you want from all of this stuff?
Yeah, what I'd like is for people to have a sense of integrity intellectually with the sorts of standards and criteria that they use to assess texts, phenomena, traditions, right? And so I see a lot of contradictions and sort of special pleading is sort of the best case, or the best term for this, because like all of these hermeneutical gestures could be used in support of other pre-modern material, right? Sure. Like, why not use all of this to affirm? If you want to talk about looking at outcome as sort of being the litmus test for whether a text is real, like Buddhists are pretty cool. They're pretty nonviolent, pretty compassionate. So like maybe we should just say, yeah, the teachings of the Buddha and everything that was written down that was sort of put in his mouth is real. Now, for the record, I'm not being this isn't I'm equal opportunity here, right? If you look at the texts that relate the Buddha's teachings, they were written hundreds of years after he lived, right? So how much of that is oral tradition and how much of that was what he actually said and that sort of a thing? It's all there too.
We don't even have to go this far. I mean, you just go to any Pentecostal church, and I'd say you can go to almost any church, period.
Mm-hmm.
And you're awash in all of these issues. And as a pastor, I'm awash in all of these issues. Pastor, I believe God is telling us to do X.
Yeah.
All right. Well, how am I going to figure that out? Yeah. Am I thinking that somebody on a big chair is going to move his lips and that's going to come down to him? And pastors have been dealing with this. In fact, we've all been dealing with this all of our life.
Right.
I don't believe your father, um, I don't believe your father wanted this for you. I remember when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, the worst pastors to deal with were the dead pastors. That's because at least if the pastor was alive, I could go to him and I could ask him a question. But I had to deal with the dead pastors. The pastor never would have wanted this for his church. I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
But yet we live in the midst of it. And when we get into this question of the metamodern, this is exactly what we're dealing with, because this prison that the Bible was in, all of these arguments that you're giving me, I have read. I've got, plenty of books. That this is an entire wave that went through modernity. And so after the dust had settled, after the documentary hypothesis had been chewed up and there was endless warfare, is this the Yahwist or is this the priestly, and on and on and on, someone like Robert Alter comes through and says, hey, but the way that text is actually laid out, it's really kind of brilliant, because they were talking about these other things. And whereas everybody sort of wanted to fight about, well, what, did Jonah really happen? Everybody wanted to fight about this. Life went on with all sorts of people. And for the most part, the people who are really worried about, well, let's see, the physical correspondencism of the ancient world with respect to the text that we are reading. Those are really fun questions to dive into. But for the most part,
I think
they're not as real as actually what the text has produced all throughout history.
Okay. But all right, so I'll be really real. I think
All right.
I think that one of
you
the
need
things
to be authentic.
yeah, right, that the text has produced is a lot of suffering and a lot of violence, a lot of warfare, a lot of self-delusion, a lot of problems. And so I don't think we can just point to the text and be like, well, maybe they're not real historically, but they produced a lot of good, because not even that really holds up. It's sort of like, actually, and this gets to some of that, well, we can come back to this, but the idea that like someone's cancer gets miraculously healed by God because, hey, because he told me or something, right? It's sort of like, oh, okay, what kind of a God does that? And like,
Yeah.
look at what else is going on in the world. Like, why does God, oh, I got a great parking space this morning because I was praying and it happened. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, what about famine? What about the Holocaust? Right. So like, it creates a lot of issues that we should take very seriously. And I think that also the way you're framing it downplays the profound impact that this stuff has on intellectual people, that people find it incredibly difficult to assent to a religious faith that seems like they need to just ignore all of the fact of 2,000 years of history and science, that now they have to just check that at the door because, okay, why? Because this will improve my life or something like that, right? And so actually a lot of the meaning crisis is a consequence of the fact that like, it's very hard for people to assent to this stuff, and we can make hermeneutical gestures and say, but language, and what do we mean by real, and what do we mean, what's a symbol, and all this stuff. It's like that just doesn't cut it for some people. Of like it, and also, and the last thing about the special pleading, it's like, why do this for Christianity? Why not do it for any of the other traditions? What all these things could be used to justify any claim, any story from the past. I mean, this is the same kind of actual like postmodern rhetoric that gets used these days, and like alternative facts, and what do we mean by a fact, and who's to say, and all this stuff. And so what we really need to grapple with is like, history matters, facts matter, stories do matter, and even false stories can be meaningful and helpful for people, but then let's own them as false stories that are meaningful and helpful. Or how can we do that? Is that even possible? Those are the questions that I feel like a metamodern Christianity has to grapple with. But if we're still maintaining the possibility that like people levitate, maybe babies burst out of their wombs and do crazy stuff because we don't have all the records for every birth, and all that kind of way of looking at reality, then we're like, I think from a modern historical critical lens and integrating that frame, we're just ignoring all of the insights of the modern world, and we're not coming to grips with it. So if we're going to have a robust, strong Christianity going forward, it's got to be able to do something that I'm not hearing coming out of this conversation. So I'm grappling with that.
what I've heard from you is mostly the sum of the modernist and the postmodernist critique.
Well, I haven't even gotten much into the postmodernist stuff, which gets more into like
No,
social
but there's
construction.
but when you basically, so this is the funny thing. Our hope is that if we can get our language, and this is where I wanted to bring in McGilchrist, because I don't know if you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist at all.
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
Hemisphere
so you basically
guy,
got this idea that you've got this two perspectives on the world. And one is I'm dyslexic, so I always get the two confused. So the master brain and the emissary brain. And that way I don't have to worry about right and left, because that's a problem for me.
Every time I talk right and left, I literally have to put my hands out in front of me.
Yeah, I know, me too.
Okay, left. Yeah.
When I listen to your critique, I hear, well, first of all, with a modern critique, the question is, well, if we get all of the physicalist correspondence correctly, then we can. The difficulty with this is that the emissary brain, that physicalist arrangement, is sneaking in an eschatological hope. Because, I mean, you just did what's really funny is because we want to argue what Thomas saw and when did he see it. When
I'd like to go deeper than that. But
well, when you just said, this text has caused endless suffering throughout human history, I don't think you can do that math with modernity.
True.
Because endless history, is that a thing? I mean, all of human history, is that a thing? Is Western civilization a thing? The reason we've got beyond modernity is because we want the more we work the program, the more we see it's unworkable. Because the problem with facts aren't that we don't know any. The problem is that we know too many. And this is where John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau's, this is where all this work has come in. Because if you say the Bible has caused tremendous suffering in human history, well, then you're going to have to, in a modernist frame, tell me about human history. And neither of us have enough lifetime for that. And it's not accessible to us.
Well, I can tell you a lot about the suffering of the religious wars, and you go back and I mean, it's all documented. Like I don't see that being as a particularly controversial claim that.
But we can't run the experiment the other way. We can't run the experiment. Well, let's talk about Brian. Let's say somewhere along the line there was a story that Brian rose from the dead instead of Jesus, and he said, "Blessed are the cheesemakers instead of the peacemakers." And we can insert Brian back 2,000 years and say, okay, can we do the math if, let's say, history would have been better if the story of Brian was truer than the story of Jesus?
Well, I don't think that's the question.
Do that math in a modern way?
Well, let me clarify then. I don't think that's the question. The question is, what do we do today, knowing what we know? How do we integrate the insights of religious tradition? I think that no matter what, I mean, my understanding of history is that we had to develop, we had to learn, we had to come to a greater understanding of reality. And so inevitably we were going to see the world in religious terms, in mythological terms for a long time. So I don't think there is a counter version of that. And you look at Piagetian developmental learning theory, like we were always bound to assimilate knowledge to our own constructs. And so we were always going to tend to do anthropomorphism and animism and artificialism and all that. And it's taken a long time, but over the course of human history, we have started to see more and more of the laws and the mechanical nature of things and the naturalistic aspects of things and the chance things and all that. And that's expanded our picture. And so now the question is, well, what do we keep from tradition? And I think what I thought you were making the point a minute ago was that modernity doesn't have a great track record at all either. I mean, you look at the 20th
I
century.
love modernity.
Well,
Trust me. I got an
yeah,
electric car. I love
right.
that sucker.
No.
It works.
Yeah, and we have to integrate and appreciate that. So I'm not
Yep.
anti-modern. I'm just saying that it's the case about saying, oh, all the suffering's been caused by this particular way of seeing reality. Well, it's like, well, yeah, a lot of the totalitarian ideologies of the modern period also created a lot of suffering. So that shouldn't be the only litmus test here. But what I am saying is that I do believe that we have moved through history and gained more understanding of reality. And now we're in a place to look back and look at the religious traditions and try to determine how much of this do we carry forward and how do we understand them. And for me, that's what I'm grappling with, because I think if we just say, well, yes, people actually went up into heaven and there were these miracles, we're not like really taking modernity seriously. But maybe I'm overly reiterating my thesis at this point.
I have never been at a funeral. Well, here's a question. That's not really a question, it's an observation. As modernity has sort of increased, we've had less funerals.
Mm.
Because why? And it's funny what seems real to people. Now, we can have a debate about the epilepsy of Julius Caesar. And, to what degree was Caesar's epilepsy, or was it epilepsy? Because, of course, they didn't have the word epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
Julius Caesar, there was a spirit that would sometimes seize Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
And that, of course, was understood in a particular way. But a lot of the spirit of Julius Caesar was pretty significant historically. And part of how I understand the recession of modernity is that we have fought a lot about the biochemical processes in Julius Caesar's brain, even though we can't hope to actually approach that in any modernist way, when there have been many more quite real things impacting us that have been around us the whole time. We just haven't had language for it.
Mm.
And part of what's happening is that people are, well, you mentioned the meaning crisis. I think as John frames the meaning crisis, you can find episodes of the meaning crisis all throughout history. But I think he's right that there's been an intensification,
Mm-hmm.
and that this intensification has everything to do with modernity. Because if you want to if and say, I don't agree that either avoiding suffering or achieving suffering is necessarily the goal by which we should measure everything with.
Mm.
Because truth be told, I think the reality of my life is that certain sufferings that I have had to endure, if I had to go back, I'd very much like to avoid them. But certain riches that I have been blessed with have been a direct result of those same sufferings.
Mm-hmm.
And so even just say using suffering as a litmus test for value, I think is some place I'd rather not go.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, if we are to make that argument about suffering, to go to your grandma's bed and she looks up at you and says, I'm scared of dying. I've always thought that, Jesus would take me home.
Mm.
Take me home. Home? You mean a house? No, that's not what she means. Home. Well, what do you mean, Grandma? And she has a few vague ideas, probably from a childhood Bible or a whole bunch of Hollywood movies or
Mm-hmm.
ideas about who Jesus is. And you say, oh, Grandma, I don't know why you bother with any of this. It's all been disproven. Why don't we just up the drugs a little bit more, and then pretty soon you will no longer be.
No,
Nobody says that.
no, nobody should say that.
Nobody should say that.
Yeah.
So why on one hand do we have this urgent need to disavow people of their myths in the cause of suffering?
Good question. So here's the way I would look at that is that uh, there are certain pastoral activities and certain capacities of someone in a ministering capacity that are about skillful means. It's about meeting people where they're at. It's about reading a situation and see what would bring the most benefit to people in a particular context. And then related to that, it's about knowing what people are capable of and what degree of depth they're interested in pursuing intellectual questions and philosophical ones and exploring to the depths of reality. And people vary a lot in that. And so if you see someone who is interested in and is passionate to learn and to question and to be willing to deal with the uncomfortableness and the cognitive dissonance and all that stuff and really try to deepen their spiritual journey by questioning and exploring their faith, and like that should itself be ministered to. But if someone's dying and not interested in that stuff at all and has no concern for it, or maybe they were but now they're facing the end of their days and so they're fearful and concerned, then obviously at a humane level this is not enter the mix here. But all that said, right, we're trying to, and well, this relates directly actually, so I'll throw this into the mix too. To be clear, I don't find the answer satisfactory from the modernist lens. I think that is kind of the point you're really getting at in this story, and I'm sympathetic to that. So I'm not, and I don't want people to misunderstand me here, as I'm not a modernist trying to be like, oh, this is what the takeaway needs to be, and we all need to be atheists, and all these stories are bunk and all that. No, but we do need to move through modern thought. We do need to grapple with those questions, right? But what we do need is a psychologically fulfilling answer to the enduring human condition and to understanding what the sacred is, understanding what we mean by things like spirituality and meaning. And I personally think that we can actually have very satisfying, compelling answers to those things that do justice to all the facts, quote unquote, from a historical critical lens and the postmodern critique.
You really don't want to say all the facts.
Why not?
You really don't want to say all the facts, because again, this is the whole point of the conversation. None of us can or ever will have all the facts, and how we manage facts, combinatorial explosiveness, go to John Vervaeke language, how we manage combinatorial explosiveness has everything to do with all of these questions.
Well, as someone who has made the point repeatedly that we use language in all sorts of ways, right? All the facts is an expression. Brendan,
yeah, it is.
Don't believe that a person's mind can contain all the facts. I'm just saying that.
And so you'd like to poke on this resurrection. I'd like to poke on all the facts.
Sure,
because I think we're leading people down a bad road.
Poke away. I mean, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. So I'll clarify that.
I understand. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I shouldn't be so pedantic.
But what I do mean though, right, is that as best as we can know what is up, and I also, it's very important to build into our understanding that we're always learning and that we never have the final answer. One of the ways I think we can tackle some of this stuff you were bringing up from earlier is that we shouldn't presume that the scientific paradigm is the final one, that there's not a lot more to learn about reality, that like, oh, actually maybe people can levitate, but rather than see that as sort of like a supernatural phenomenon, it's like, oh, actually, like, we realize that there's this whole other field going on here that, this Hadron Collider just brought our attention to, and now we can do all these experimental studies that can show that like certain things, and it actually, partakes in socio-linguistic, whatever. Like, my point is we can naturalize those understandings of things, because the natural is the real, and that to me is also a very important aspect of the kind of modern insight that I want to be true to. So anyway, just to wrap all that up, I think that all that is possible. Like, I think that we can have a spiritually, psychologically, socially effective and satisfactory answer to questions of meaning and the sacred and all these things in a way that does that with great intellectual integrity. And that's what I'm excited about, and that's what I'd like to see more brought into the conversation. So that's all.
If you want to know what the epitome of modernity is in language, just track the use of the word we. Because right away when I started making my videos, I started talking about a monarchical vision, which is sort of the essential modernist move.
A monarchical vision?
A monarchical vision.
Okay.
I sort of move out of the fact that I was born a specific year to specific parents, and now I am going to speak over all of eternity,
right,
with this we.
Uh-huh.
And it's because we can have a more satisfying, because the problem with that sentence is, of course, once you start paying attention to people, and at least the sample of people that I've known, so I'll try not to insert people for we, because we often use those in the same way.
Uh-huh.
What different people find satisfying, again, if that is the standard, is remarkably difficult, because it's remarkably varied. And I think one way to see this might be when you look at the meaning crisis, and John Vervaeke's thesis is that the death of the legacy religions provoked an intensification and a widespread meaning crisis, because the kinds of things that religions used to provide to people on a broad scale is no longer available to them for all of the reasons that you have just laid out. Now, then the question is, okay, so now what? Because I agree with you.
Exactly.
I agree with you that modernity and the Enlightenment have produced many wonderful things for us, things that I enjoy, things that, in fact, Haitians in the Dominican Republic would love to enjoy. I mean, if you really want to solve Haiti, maybe just tell everyone in the land of Haiti, free pass to the United States, just like they did to Cuba. Most of Haiti will, and we'll get you on the boat. Let's take in 9 million Haitians. It's not that many people. Let's take in 9 million Haitians this year. They can come to the United States, live wherever they want. And Haitian immigrants have had an amazing track record of coming into the United States and flourishing in our Western capitalist society. So all of that is well and good, and I get that. Now, one of the things that I've been seeing in my journey is that people that we did a little event in Southern California, and appended to the event is a little tour of an Orthodox church. So we go to this Orthodox church, and I've got plenty of bones to pick with just about every other religious tradition from my own. I've got even more bones to pick with my own because I know it better. But I'm sitting there in this church, and I'm looking at a whole bunch of young men on their knees kissing a box of relics on their way out. And a number of these young men I know, because I've talked to many of these young men just 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, were big fans of Sam Harris. And I thought, that's interesting. Why would these people that were worshiping at the feet of Sam Harris, now they weren't really worshiping at his feet. No, but if you sort of understand the relationship between attention and worship, they paid a lot of attention to Sam Harris. They paid a lot of attention to the new atheists and everything. And now here they are in Southern California, knees on $1 million worth of marble from the old world, putting their lips on a box, probably full of germs from all the other dudes' lips, and because someone says that the stuff in this box is actually associated with, and I'm a Protestant. So I tell you, you show me a box of relics and boy, all that Protestant DNA kicks in right away in my mind.
Okay.
But I watch that and I say, huh, you know who's not having a meaning crisis? Those dudes on the floor. And if you talk to them, as I've spoken with these guys, you know who would say their life has taken a significant upgrade? Those guys.
Well,
and you have to say, huh, now I fully get, because I've got in my little corner of the internet, Peugeot's corner has plenty of those guys. Vervaeke's corner, they tend to be working other ways. My little corner, I tend to got a lot of the Christian skeptics and deconstructionists. And so many people have come to me and said, Pastor, I would love nothing better than to believe. I would love nothing better. And I just can't get my mind around the virgin birth. I just can't get my mind around Thomas touching Jesus' wounds. I just can't go there. And I say, okay, I'll pray for you. I can give you some sociological arguments that would say, if you really want to believe these things, start hanging out with people who do for about 3 or 4 years, and you'll probably get there.
Well, what would happen if you hung out with more relic box kissing people?
Well, and that's the experiment we're running right now, because I don't know. I suspect, even just based on early results, that some of them will be kissing relics for now, and some of them will probably stop and might go back to forms of Protestantism that they grew up with. Some of them might stay in Orthodoxy. Some of them might become Anglican. Some of them might not even go to church all that much. I mean, it's going to be all over the map. And that's where I say, again, I have way too many facts because I've talked to way too many people. And it's going to be messy.
Well, briefly, I would just say that I don't see the difference between believing in a virgin birth versus believing that a box contains a relic and that if you kiss it, it gives you some quality of grace. Like, to me, those are both what I would think of as sort of like non-scientific claims. And then if you're outside the context of naturalism, which both of those claims are, then how do you adjudicate between, which is more believable versus another? And that's one of the benefits of a naturalistic framing, is it's like, whatever problems there are, and there are many problems with the scientific framework and with reductionism that creeps in with modernity, et cetera, there is a kind of remarkable coherence to a lot of it as well. And maybe people would take issue with that, because obviously there's a lot on the fringes that we're still trying to work out. But like, there are standard models of how, physics works and chemistry and stuff, and like a remarkable integrity and coherence to the whole thing. And you don't find that in the religious context, where some people will say, yes, well, of course, I'll pray for you if you don't believe in the virgin birth, but if you go and kiss those relics, well, gosh, good luck, fella. It's sort of like, that's hard to adjudicate. But I wanted to, and I'll give you an opportunity
let me just talk about that frame.
Sure.
Because what you just did was bring in the modernist frame.
Yeah.
You said the virgin birth and kissing relics are the same thing.
Well, they're not the same, but they
basically said, but again, because physically they're not the same thing.
Right. We've been very careful with trying to, not elide things. So I was like, oh no, well, just, I said what I said, but yes.
But that is the Enlightenment critique.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Protestants tried to keep the virgin birth and tried to no longer kiss relics.
Yeah.
And they wound up.
It's a slippery slope.
Well, some of them threw it all away and said, no longer believe in the virgin birth. And I no longer kiss relics. Others kept one and not the other. Right. So, but again, the point I'm trying to make is that the fact that you saw the connection between those two things, that is a spirit. That is a frame.
What's a frame?
Is now, you see, you like the frame.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it
like the spirit.
A spirit, because when I'm talking to a pastor who's trying to make the argument for supernatural, non-naturalistic phenomena, if a
there's
word like
another frame,
if a word like spirit gets into the conversation, I'm like, I'm not sure if we mean the same thing by that, right? I mean, so it becomes very
So
slippery.
there's a helpful word, because then we're actually going to have something to talk about, because I can use the word in terms of school spirit and the spirit that is actually in the house you grew up in.
Yeah.
And now I can also talk about the spirit of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Now, if I frame it that way, see, frame is a very new word.
Mm.
And natural, supernatural, that's also a very new framing.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very new terms that have come along. In fact, frame is very new. But if I say spirit, then suddenly we have new avenues, because, you know, what I hear from people who say, I can't believe this stuff in this way. Basically what I hear then, my own framing is, I hear, okay, we're sort of still stuck in the modernist fundamentalist fight, because that's what that fight was about.
Well, sure. The modernist fundamentalist fight, which largely I would admit this conversation has sort of been rehashing, is
I don't think I'm a fundamentalist.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that.
No,
I'm just saying,
I don't take it as an insult.
Okay.
I love fundamentalists.
All right.
But and there certainly is some of that in there. But my whole point is, when you get into this term like metamodernity, we are trying to get past modern, postmodern, and then in many ways we're sort of in the Vervaeke side of the conversation. How can we relieve people of the meaning crisis and not lose elements of the modern and the postmodern?
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue, well, we're going to be playing with elements here. And that's basically where the conversation lies.
Yeah. I agree with that. And yeah, we can start to wrap up. I know we've been talking for a while. I'm also happy to keep talking if you want. But you know, I also don't want to make
this has been fun. I don't want to make
too many demands on the audience. But just to respond to that last part real quick.
No demands on the audience. They can't listen to it. These people are listening to Joe Rogan. Yeah. They go 4 or 5 hours.
This is true.
But I do have to land, because I do have some other things I got.
Okay, yeah. I just want to say briefly, I mean, this conversation I think largely did sort of rehearse a kind of classic modern, pre-modern debate, right? And that was helpful to some degree, but it also does, I think, remain at an impasse, and so. I think it's.
But I'm going to say something that's a little bit touchy here, and I hope you understand. This is a good faith argument.
Yeah,
you're the one that's demanding they give up physicalist connections with things like the virgin birth and the resurrection. These things. That's not me.
Yeah. Well, I'm not demanding that anyone give anything up. I'm grappling with intellectual history and trying to find a way forward for spirituality. And many, many people are facing that struggle, as you just alluded to. That's like, I'd like to believe, but I can't just do it. So I'm not.
But some aren't. They're kissing boxes with bones from who knows where.
Right.
Being as a Protestant.
And just briefly to that point too, right? You said, well, they're not having a meaning crisis. It's like, well, I mean, this is really important to the degree that we think about the realness of things also in the consequences, right? And I think that this traditionalist turn is not going to lead to good consequences for people. For some folks, it might just be what they need. It might just fit the bill and they're very happy and it allows them to flourish, in which case, I think, again, to bring back the developmental angle here, we have to just be celebratory of that people are going to be approaching these things at different levels and different degrees of depth, and that we shouldn't demand is not the thing here. It's more like there is a crisis that in this moment of intellectual history, people are struggling to know how to do the meaning thing outside of religion, given the critiques of modernity and postmodernity. So what I'm trying to do is chart that path forward. And for me, I would say that there are certain commitments that have really resonated with me through my own spiritual journey of deconstructing certain things and going through the historical critical process and the study of all that, I feel very confident that I land on certain claims about reality, and then I want to carry those forward. And I want to carry those forward, though, out of what has been largely a reductionistic and a nihilistic and an atheistic and a materialistic frame. And I want to bring that into a frame where those things don't have to be viewed in that light, that we can actually have a fully naturalistic mentality, but that we can also have a fully flourishing sense of meaning and spirituality and sense of the sacred. And I believe that's, I mean, I have my own senses of how that looks and what that what that looks like. But I really appreciate your perspective, and I appreciate you two very much being, on the ground and in a congregation, and um, being a part of people's faith journeys in the day to day that you're navigating. And so,
Well, let me tell you about Job,
sure.
because this is an easy one. The guy named Job lives in the Netherlands, and what's fun about Job is this all happened on video. Job was really struggling with depression, was trying to, deal with his depression with diet, exercise, modern medicine, all of the things, all of the modern things, dealing with all of that. Finds Jordan Peterson. Job's a hardcore atheist. It's all bullshit. Hardcore atheist. Finds Jordan Peterson. Starts watching Jordan Peterson. And I'm using Job because there are dozens of people that I've talked to that have the same story.
Mm-hmm.
Starts watching videos of Jordan Peterson. And he's like, I've been fighting my depression for a long time. I'm obsessively, this is 2016, 2017, 2018. I'm obsessively watching Jordan Peterson because I don't know why. I just, after I watch Jordan Peterson, I feel better. And it's like, every time you get a little bottle of pills, you have all these side effects. There's side effects to watching YouTube because there's spirits coming through the screens. Boy, that sounds really wooey, doesn't it? But you have to understand what I mean by spirits, like school spirit, the spirit in your house. There's spirits coming through the screens. And so Job and I just continue to have a bunch of conversations. And, he starts out as just a total atheist. And the more we talk, I can't really take credit because all of this stuff is changing in him. And then he's like, I've started praying. Well, why would you do that? Well, and he's watching me on YouTube. And then, he's, before you know it, he's a volunteer firefighter, and the fire department's right across. I've been to his house now. It's right across the street from his house. A couple of those guys go to church. So he's like, go into a building and listen to somebody in a robe ramble for an hour. How much harm can it do? Starts going to church. Bit by bit by bit. And then, he was baptized as an infant because he's in the Netherlands and that was pretty common. And so then he finds himself believing. And this is a smart guy. He works in IT. He for a long time, he was sending me books and sending me, books to read. And this is a very smart guy, successful in business, all of this stuff, and eventually he just finds himself believing, and he just finds it to be the most hilarious thing in the world because, to think that he would believe, and then he joins his church, and then his church wants to make him an elder, and he's in a Dutch Reformed church, which is sort of connected to the denomination that I am a part of. But he really finds that praying the rosary really helps. Now, if my grandfather had heard that someone in the Dutch Reformed church is praying the rosary, he would have said, there's no business of a Reformed Christian praying the rosary.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what Job does. And he prays the rosary because he finds it helps. Mm-hmm. And now he's had a couple of kids, and he's an elder in his church, and he's got more questions than when he started. And he's got more he can talk about these questions than when he began. Now that he's, neck deep involved in a church, he's got even more questions. But if you'd ask him, what about this? You used to be a perfectly normal person who used to say that the Bible and religion, it was all bullshit. And now you're an elder in a church and you do the crazy thing of praying a rosary while you're an elder in the church. If you would ask me what metamodernity looks like, I would say it looks like Job.
Mm.
That now there's been definitely some loosening of a whole bunch of things from the Enlightenment. And he's a computer scientist. And so he knows science.
Mm-hmm.
He's very much living in this world. And if you ask him questions about this or that, he could talk for a long time about his questions, and his questions won't be far from modernity or postmodernity. Now, a lot of people might jump in and say, well, I really want to know about his politics. And I would say, why? Because remember what I said early on? When the church sort of hollowed out, we were left with
Mm-hmm.
political activists and therapists.
Mm.
Okay, fine. There's nothing wrong with politics. There's nothing wrong with therapy. But when you talk about metamodern spirituality, it looks a lot like Job.
Mm.
And it looks a lot like these guys kissing relics. And it looks a lot like you. And so people are getting to the other end of both modernity and postmodernity, and it's kind of a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Because the monolithic traditions that were, number one, probably not quite as monolithic as we imagine they were, because a close reading of the New Testament says, boy, that fight between the Judaizers and Paul was a fierce one.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the church that emerges, there's all sorts of mess and fights and all of that going on. And all the way through history, I think people are wrestling with, what do we mean by spirit? Why? What is the significance of that box in the corner of that church in Southern California? Why would it make sense for an elder in a Dutch Reformed church to pray the rosary? I think that's what we're coming into.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot, and I think that arc that Job went through sounds like a very good one. It sounds like a one that led to a very good place. And yeah, without getting, I mean, I don't really care about their politics, but to the degree that they're living a full, robust life, flourishing, they're not depressed anymore. They have a rich family life. They have deep relationships. They have all that. That sounds great. That is one arc. And I think of whatever this metamodern Christianity thing is, or just metamodern religion, there'll be many different kinds of arcs. And there's a plurality of different ways of thinking about this. So this is a conversation. It's a dialogue. It's an exploration of what those different possibilities are. And just because I'm coming at it from a certain angle, I don't want to preclude other possibilities for these things. And I'm probably even in the minority in this conversation space around what this looks like. But just briefly, I will also say that another narrative arc could be presented, and you can call this person Brendan Graham Dempsey, who started out maybe a bit more where Job ended up. In a religious tradition, and had a deep devotional religious life and a deep prayer life, and was deeply connected with his faith, cared about it so much he decided to go study it and devote his life to it, goes to school, studies it, finds that when you apply the methods of the modern historical critical approach to that, things produce profound contradictions and difficulties and cognitive dissonances that when Brendan goes back to his family and his church, tries to get answers to these questions, finds that people don't want to talk about that or don't have satisfactory answers or feel threatened by it, to a point where eventually he has to give all that up and say, all right, well, I have to just follow where I feel like the truth is leading. And even though this is profoundly uncomfortable and hard to do, no longer being able to just naively believe in a certain perspective and then deal with depression and then deal with nihilism and then have to work through that and then find your way to a frame where there's a return of meaning and a new understanding and an interpretation of meaning and an understanding that arc, that narrative development actually has a developmental logic to it, and that people's faiths can evolve and their understanding of reality can deepen and evolve and change, and that God as a concept and as a reality can evolve and change. and to feel a profound new sense of meaning and insight and importance and vocation even in pursuing that, and then devote yourself again to trying to follow that thread into the future and to help other people who are also grappling with the depression and the struggle that comes from not having that faith and not knowing what to do with it, because you can't just return to where you came from. And that to me is also a very metamodern arc, and I think both of those arcs can find a place in this, and I'm happy to hear other people's arcs and how that pans out. So yeah, it's a diverse space, and I really welcome what's happening. I think it's deeply valuable that we're starting to move into this conversation. When I've talked to Vervaeke in the past, it's come up like, what about the legacy religions? What about this? And how do we bring in the ancient religions in a way and carry them forward? But now I feel like we're really grappling with that directly, at least as it pertains to Christianity. And so I look forward to having conversations with like people like Paul Anleitner and I don't know, maybe Christian Wyman, other people who are really exploring this stuff. And I really deeply appreciated this conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time and dealing with my my questions and my whatever queries and probing critiques even. So but yeah, so this is I enjoyed this. I hope you did too.
Oh no, I did. And what's funny is that we sort of did a Randall's conversation in reverse, because if I had been hosting you, we definitely would have spent an hour, a half hour to an hour just on your story. And I think that, when I talk about the monarchical vision, and when I talk about metamodernity, in modernity, you sort of start from we and all. I think in metamodernity, you start with you.
Sure.
And then you sort of build out the world from there. And I think that point of approach is not arbitrary.
Sure.
Because again, when you look at, especially Peugeot in this, but Peterson and Vervaeke to a degree, but especially Peugeot in this, even if you look at, let's say, the history of philosophy, this turn to the phenomenology and the other approach, because and this is where you have tension, and this is where, okay, I haven't said too much to get myself in trouble, but this is where some of the tension lies, let's say, in the modernist fundamentalist thing, is in modernity, we sort of swoop up on top and want to say, I want to make a declaration with respect to the state of particular molecules and atoms 2,000 years ago in a geography half around the world, and that's going to be consequential. Now, we spend all the time on the state, and then, well, why is that consequential? Because that then gets really murky, and it's really nice if we can say zebras don't have stripes, because then suddenly we can just, categorize zebras and horses all the way that we want to. But when we begin the conversation, not up here, but sort of down here and out, then I think for the most part, I think generally speaking, if metamodernity is provoked by all of the stuff that John Vervaeke talks about with respect to cog-sci, combinatorial explosiveness, the stuff Jordan Peterson talks about when he begins maps of meaning, a world of objects or a form for action. If you start with the individual and move out from there, you already have a pre-baked in, more relevant collection of facts you're dealing with than if we try to start with all of human history.
Sure. Yeah.
Because
I agree.
Who the hell am I to know what happened in all of human history?
Yeah.
No, I can speak to what I saw.
Sure. Yeah. No, and it's interesting too, especially when you're on the internet and people watch your stuff, you never quite know who knows what about your story and whether that is another opportunity to have to get into that or not. Yeah, I mean, and so maybe that's an opening for a deepening.
Maybe we'll do another. We'll do a randos. We'll start with you.
Okay.
Because to me, the most interesting thing about you is not whether or not you believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, that's not the most interesting thing about you. I'm kind of interested in it.
Mhm.
The most interesting thing about you is your story.
Yeah.
Because you are not an accumulated
Right.
set of ideas of physical rearrangements that happened in the past.
Yeah.
You were born in a certain year to a group of parents, had some experiences, encountered a bunch of things, and that has developed into where you are now. And again, as a pastor, I'm really interested in people
Yeah.
because I think people are amazing. And so I have friends that have very different beliefs about all sorts of arrangements of atoms in history.
Uh-huh.
But
Oh, I've
I
got
get
beliefs
to those
about
things
that. Let
through
me
people.
tell you, I've got some strong ideas about atoms in history. No, well, everything you're saying speaks to, I'm sure, what the qualities that I'm sure make you a very quality pastor, because there are some pastors who care a lot more about whether you believe in that physical resurrection, boy.
Yeah, and
And
don't
yeah,
get me wrong. I think
you think that's important too? No,
I think it's important
yeah,
too. But
yeah,
the question of back to the skeptics that I talk to, and they say, okay, even if people levitate, even if Jesus walked out of that cave, so what?
yeah,
And if you look at when everybody's just focusing on, well, what do you say about that arrangement?
yeah,
I think the so what,
yeah. No,
because even in the Bible,
yeah,
the so what is where all the action is. What is the implication of that?
yeah,
And that's actually where I find modernism to be terribly
yeah.
fragile
Agreed.
because when people sort of discount things willy-nilly, I've seen, I was a foreign missionary. I've seen some pretty incredible things
Hmm.
that don't really fit in the modern world. And so it's like, here's modernity with all the rules.
Yeah,
I've seen a lot. It's like,
yeah,
at the same time, I believe in physics. I believe in Newtonian physics, but Newtonian physics is, of course, within a certain context
yeah.
that Newtonian physics works.
Well,
And so,
yeah, let's carry forward the conversation. I'm glad you're open to it. I'd be happy to, start from the beginning, the reverse way, and talk about my story. And I'd love to dig into the so what question because that really is what it's all about. And happy to delve into any. I mean, I feel like we covered a lot, and it's but also there's so much more that we can
yeah.
explore. And so I appreciate your perspective very much. I appreciate the broader community that you're not just a part of, but also actively sort of tending to, even ministering to. And I think that there's a lot that can come out of more exchange and conversation. And so, yeah, if you'd be up for it, let's keep it going.
Yeah, people are going to love this video. Trust me. They
Okay,
like it
good.
when they like it when I get excited.
When you get
So
a little
anyway,
feisty. All right, good.
they like it
Well,
when I get feisty.
I'm glad to hear that. I hopefully can hone a little bit my own thoughts about this and come with a bit more clarity because I feel like I uh it, it, it's an interesting thing when you're exploring the background worldview elements that go into what we affirm and why. And so it's interesting then to have to kind of render an account for certain things that you don't often have to render an account for.
Yeah.
And it places, it's a good exercise, but it can be an interesting kind of, I was like, oh, I didn't think I'd have to explain that, but but you do, and that's sort of
Yeah.
the difficulty and the challenge, but also the possibility of this sort of work in these kinds of conversations is to really deepen the clarity around all that, and also to analyze and become aware of our own assumptions as well in the process and all that. So anyway,
Yep.
um, Paul VanderKlay, thank you so much. To be continued. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. It was fun.